This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and more dangerous. For a long time, there was an assumption baked into the system that once money was approved, once rules were written, once programs existed, they applied to everyone. Not equally, not perfectly, but universally, that assumption is breaking. Not loudly, not all at once, but deliberately. What is emerging now is a version of government that does not argue with you. It invoices you. It delays you. It withholds. Nothing is announced. Nothing is explained. And yet, entire regions begin to feel pressure at the same time. If you think this is just politics, you'll miss what's actually happening. And if you stop watching here, you won't see how far it's already gone. Because this isn't about policy failure. It's about a system quietly learning how to punish. And once that switch flips, it doesn't flip back easily. For a long time, we were taught where power lived, in offices, in speeches, in elections. That's no longer accurate. What actually controls the system now is not ideology, not popularity, not even law. It's access. Access to money already approved, access to permits already earned, access to timelines, signatures, silence. Power has migrated away from debate and into administration, into the quiet places where forms stall, where funding pauses, where approvals simply arrive never. Nothing has to be overturned. Nothing has to be repealed. The system doesn't need to change the rules if it can change who the rules reach. That's the shift. Government no longer persuades, it conditions. Support is rewarded with flow. Dissent is met with friction. Not punishment you can point to, punishment you feel. And because it looks procedural, it hides in plain sight. This is no longer about who wins elections. It's about what happens to those who don't. And that's where the danger begins to accelerate. There was a time when this kind of power moved slowly, clumsily, with paperwork that took years before the system failed by accident. Now, it fails on schedule. Before, delays were bureaucratic. Now, they are strategic. Nothing dramatic changed overnight. That's the point. This shift didn't arrive with a speech or a vote. It arrived through normalization, through repetition, through the quiet realization that nothing bad happened last time. So it happened again. Funding paused. Projects stalled. Experts sidelined. Each move small enough to defend, each one procedural, each one survivable, until survival became the baseline. That's how the most dangerous changes work. They don't announce themselves as threats. They present as adjustments. And over time, the expectation changes. States begin budgeting around uncertainty. Institutions begin self-censoring. People begin asking permission where none was required before. Not because the law changed, but because the consequences did. This is what happens when power learns patience. And the next moment makes that patience visible. Then watch this closely. Because eventually, the system stops being abstract. The first real shock doesn't arrive as a collapse. It arrives as a halt. A project that was approved, funded, planned, suddenly frozen. Not because it failed, not because it was unsafe, not because it ran out of money, but because someone higher up decided it should stop. No warning, no transition, no explanation that holds up under scrutiny. Just a directive. Billions already committed, workers already hired, communities already counting on what comes next, and then nothing. This is where the damage starts to surface. Because when something like this is interrupted midstream, the loss doesn't stay on paper. It radiates outward. Investors pull back, timelines collapse, confidence evaporates, and the message travels faster than the money ever did. If this can happen here, it can happen anywhere. If this can be stopped for no clear reason, then nothing is actually secure. If you're trying to understand how fear enters a system, this is the moment it does. And the system is just getting started. To understand why this works, you have to look underneath the pause. Because this isn't chaos, it's design. The system doesn't break the law head on. It routes around it. Money is still technically allocated. Programs still technically exist. Rules are still technically followed. But between authorization and reality, there's a gap. That gap is discretion. Discretion over timing, over interpretation, over enforcement. That's where power concentrates. The benefit flows upward to the people who decide what moves first, what moves last, what never moves at all. The cost flows downward to states forced to backfill funding, to organizations burning reserves, to families who never hear why help didn't arrive. No single decision looks catastrophic. That's intentional. Damage is distributed, so no one moment triggers alarm. No one actor appears responsible. And because it's administrative, it's invisible to most people until they're inside it. This is how retaliation becomes policy without ever being named. How loyalty becomes efficiency. How dissent becomes delay. And once a system learns it can govern this way, it doesn't need speeches anymore. It just needs time. Now the pace changes, because once a system learns this trick, it stops testing it. It starts using it. Again and again, one freeze becomes many. One delay becomes a pattern. Grants vanish. Permits stall. Funds arrive late or not at all. No announcements. No press conferences, just consequences. Entire sectors begin recalculating risk. Projects are redesigned before they're even proposed. Language is softened, criticism disappears. Not because anyone was ordered to stop, because they learned what happens if they don't. This is escalation without spectacle, control without force, and it moves faster than law can respond. By the time courts intervene, the damage has already spread. Timelines missed, jobs lost, trust eroded. The system doesn't need to win every fight. It only needs to make resistance expensive. And once that lesson is learned, it doesn't have to be repeated loudly. It just has to be remembered. That's the moment the pressure stops being theoretical. That's the moment people start adjusting their behavior before anything even happens. And that's where the real acceleration begins. And this is where it reaches you. Not as a headline, not as a court ruling, as a disruption. A program you assumed would exist doesn't. A cost you didn't plan for suddenly does. A service becomes harder to reach. Slower, conditional. You're told it's temporary. You're told it's procedural. But no one can tell you when it ends. So you adapt, you delay decisions, you absorb costs, you stop asking certain questions. Not because you agree, because uncertainty is expensive. This kind of system doesn't need to convince you. It just needs you to comply quietly. And most people do, because most people don't have leverage. This is how governance turns personal without ever naming you. How political conflict shows up as stress, time, money. If this feels familiar, that's not an accident. It means the system is already working on you. And if you want to understand where this goes next, you have to stay with it. Because what happens after this doesn't stop at borders. Because once this logic works at home, it doesn't stay contained. Systems like this export themselves. Investors notice, allies notice, markets notice. When funding becomes conditional on loyalty instead of law, predictability collapses. And predictability is the currency of global systems. Projects slow across borders, partnerships hesitate, long-term commitments shrink to short-term bets. Not because anyone issued a warning, because the risk profile changed. When one government demonstrates it can selectively turn systems on and off, others plan accordingly. Supply chains reroute, research collaborations thin out, diplomatic trust becomes provisional. This isn't isolationism, it's volatility. And volatility spreads What begins as internal retaliation shows up externally as unreliability. Agreements feel less binding. Promises feel softer. And once that perception sets in, it's hard to reverse because the question becomes global. If rules can be bent quietly at home, why would they hold firmly abroad? This is the moment the system stops being national. The pressure ripples outward, and the next phase isn't about response anymore. It's about trajectory. Where this accelerates from here depends on which path is chosen next. From here, the future doesn't split cleanly. It branches. There are three paths, all plausible, none guaranteed. The first is adjustment. Institutions adapt. Courts intervene faster. Congress hardens procedures. The system absorbs the pressure and keeps moving. Less trusting, more armored. The second is erosion. Nothing breaks outright, but delays lengthen. Exceptions multiply. Neutrality thins. Over time, people stop expecting universality at all. They plan around favoritism as if it's weather. The third is rupture, a moment when delay becomes denial. When retaliation hits something too visible to ignore, too central to reroute, and the system is forced to choose between enforcement and legitimacy. None of these paths announce themselves in advance. They reveal themselves through patterns, through what stops working first. What matters now is not intent. It's momentum, because systems don't need consensus to move forward. They only need enough friction removed. And the unsettling truth is this: we're already past the point of testing. The only question left is which direction the pressure finally gives way. This is where the story usually ends, with reassurance. With closure, that would be a mistake. Because nothing here has resolved. The system hasn't corrected itself. It has contained damage so far. The same mechanisms are still in place. The same levers still exist. The same discretion still operates quietly every day. What's changed is awareness. And awareness doesn't stop a process. It just lets you see it. The danger isn't collapse. It's normalization. A future where access is never assumed, where neutrality is conditional, where stability depends on alignment instead of law. If that sounds abstract, it won't stay that way. Systems like this always move closer to the individual over time. So the real question isn't whether this ends, it's whether it deepens unnoticed. If you want to understand what happens next, you have to keep watching. Keep tracking the pattern, not the headlines. Because the next phase won't arrive as a shock. It will arrive as a continuation. And by the time it feels undeniable, it will already be familiar.